Thanks everyone for joining. We're going to start. My name is Dan. I work for Collider Ventures. I'm part of the legal team. And the title of our panel is Legal Fundamentals for Founding a Web3 Project, which means we're going to cover everything. I'll start by introducing the panel. So ladies first, we have Anna Kleczewski, who is a legal counsel at Barnard Lawson. Is based in Switzerland, and she focuses on crypto regulation and advising crypto projects. Next to me is Chris Duncan, who is a counsel at Carey Olsen. It's a law firm, and he's based out of the Cayman Islands. Chris works with many Web3 projects, including Israeli projects who establish operations and entities in jurisdiction like the Cayman Islands, BVI. And last but not least, we have Yoni Irom from Meitar. He is a partner. He's heading the crypto regulation, the crypto practice. And if there's any founders here that are Israelis, you're probably represented by Yoni at some point. So we're very happy to have this excellent bunch here. And I'm going to start with a question for Israeli founders who they want to start a company. They want to start some kind of, we call it project, but a crypto startup. And we used to see all these, complex structures. You want to issue a token, you want to have a DAO. And slowly over the last few years, we saw this kind of consolidation towards maybe a more traditional way of organizing these projects. And I want to present a question to Yoni, who works with a lot of Israeli companies. How do you see this change? What are these benefits of having this company to start the project? And really, how do you see the shift and the reason to have it, basically? Go ahead.
Okay. So unfortunately, Israel, even though it has a very big tech community and a Web3 community, the regulation here is not very crypto friendly, and also the banks in particular are very not crypto friendly, which creates kind of like this clash where people want to set up companies in Israel. People are located in Israel. On the other hand, it's very hard to operate a company in Israel. And a lot of times people were looking offshore and trying to set up structures in various jurisdictions. But it's also very difficult to do that. Like when you're two founders and you haven't really raised money, if you raised a small seed investment to start setting up offshore structures, and even if you do it offshore, if you don't have it decentralized, it could still be considered Israeli for various purposes. So even that doesn't really solve the situation. And it also really depends on the nature of the company. There are companies that are more, or projects I should say, there are projects that are more decentralized focused from day one. Those are like more DeFi projects or things of that nature. And then I guess with the whole Web3 kind of concept, you have companies building kind of products from Web2 on Web3. And those companies really don't need to, and that could take a few years, and they're not necessarily considering decentralizing the whole project. And then it probably makes more sense to start like in your local jurisdiction. We see that also in other places other than Israel. And then at some point, if you want to launch a protocol or something, then you start doing a transfer, setting up an entity that can support the offshore structure.
And I assume this issue is not incredibly specific to Israel. So maybe Chris, you want to add anything on that regard?
Hi everyone. I mean, I guess to Yoni's point, I think a lot of the structuring, if you're going to do something offshore, depends on what the business is, the underlying business. So, we get quite a lot, and Anna and I were speaking about this before, we get quite a lot of people saying to us, hey, we need a Cayman Foundation. We're like, why? And they're like, don't know. I've found a friend told us. And actually, they might be wanting to start a centralized exchange, and so for instance, an offshore foundation might not make sense, and maybe they want a traditional company or things like that. So it's very much sort of business focused, business first, and then that often will then tie into the right structure for fundraising. To Yoni's point as well, if the plan is to have a value accrete to a token, or that's the hope, then an equity only raise maybe doesn't make sense, or maybe it makes sense to start with, and then you down the line you have a token, and I think particularly for sort of Israeli clients that I've worked with, the strict nature of the regulations here mean that if there is going to be a token and the business is going to be Web3, often the operational aspects of token and things like that need to sort of happen offshore, Cayman, BVI, Switzerland, other places.
So the mic doesn't work, so we should just speak louder. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
The microphone doesn't do anything. We should raise our voices, but not yell.
I need a strong voice then.
Yeah. Anna, project.
But fake speakers here also.
I do want to add one thing, which maybe goes more to Yoni's point. Is so a place like Israel, no problem. A place like Israel, we said the regulation here is not existent, if not clear, but it doesn't mean you can. By setting up these foreign entities, meaning you're free from Israel. So instead of complexing the project early on, and what we see, the trend over at least the last year, and it kind of really focused on that, is we need to create an actual business. We need to create actual operation. We need to create a product. Decentralization will come. We'll see how it works. We'll do it maybe more maturely, and it will raise questions that the project will have to address, but going full on, issuing a token, having a foreign foundation doesn't cure everything. It will create problems, other problems that we saw some projects. It really hurt. Basically, was to the detriment of the project. I want to let Anna an option to say anything that you want to add.
Well, I come from a jurisdiction where, contrary to a lot of others, like Switzerland, we have some rules that give some answers that are already quite clear for now. So you don't always like the answers, because sometimes it's like you need to comply with AML requirements, but at least you know what you stand on, as like you have some solid ground there. And we had a lot of projects that came from like the BVI, Cayman Islands, or other jurisdictions, and they already have an entity there. Then you have to work with that. So it's like, oh, I want an assessment on their Swiss law because this is going to work out for me, but I have an entity in a different jurisdiction. So they spend like twice the amount of money because we have to restructure the whole thing to make it work. So that's actually a fair point. Like if you don't have a product that's already running, you don't have revenues yet, don't consider like tax aspects, you don't have a product yet, don't consider like all those jurisdictions just because it's a trend, but maybe start with like a software development company, develop the product first, and then you're gonna check. You can have like a very easy entity in some countries, like you can start in the UK for not much, you can start for 20k in Switzerland, for 12k actually in Belgium, for example. Just start with that, develop the code, and then you'll see. You may get like a first investor. It will give you some money to pay for a lawyer who can like structure things from a regulatory perspective and go from there. Otherwise, like showing up and saying, I'm going to the BVI, I have no idea why. I'm going to Switzerland, but I have no idea why as well. It doesn't make much sense, especially, for example, Switzerland. A lot of people go there because you have this branding of like Switzerland, you're regulated. But that makes sense for DeFi. Yeah, exactly. The crypto valley, it makes a lot of sense, but especially if you're financial related somehow. If you could be regulated from a financial perspective, it makes sense. If you do gaming or something that could be considered gambling, well, Switzerland is not actually a good choice for that. There are some offshore jurisdictions that are way better.
Yeah,
so think
and
about
obviously,
it.
Regulation is changing, so trying to like think that the world is as it is right now and building on it may be completely irrelevant in 6 months. So Anna led me to the next maybe phase in a young project life, which is receiving an investment. Probably the most important thing that the company or the startup is thinking about when starting. And in terms of trends in investments in Web3 startups, we also saw this shift that kind of goes along with, going more with a company, Chevra Ba'am to the Israelis here, like the regular, what we're used to see. So about the move from SAFT to equity, we'll explain what everything means in a moment. I want to bring the question back to Yoni again. So you really saw this move in terms of investment trends. Nowadays we have the safe plus warrant, the merits, the pros and cons, also the warrant itself. Why is it good? Why is it bad? So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in the last cycle, many companies did what's called ICOs or token sales, and they essentially raised a lot of money, and then a lot of them didn't really deliver or worse on their on their promises, and that basically resulted, there was no governance, because basically they were raising tons of money, and at the end of the day, only the founders were the shareholders of the entity, and the investors had no say, and that doesn't really happen in traditional startup companies. And after kind of the last bear market, investors kind of started reevaluating, structuring these things, and they decided, okay, we need equity, we need governance, in addition to buying tokens. And also, I think it was caused by the fact that a lot of more traditional VCs started entering the space in like 2020, 2021, and they're familiar with getting equity, and oftentimes their partnership agreements of their funds require them to purchase equity. So they kind of moved to this structure of where they invest in equity and they receive some kind of token right. It could be a token warrant or a token side letter that says that if the company issues tokens, then they'll also get tokens. But during the building stage, they're equity holders. They'll have typical equity rights like board representation, veto rights, and information rights, and they can basically help track how the company's doing. And rather than just kind of investing in a token and hoping for the best. And I just add one more thing. Also, for like in jurisdictions where there's tax, like Israel, an equity investment is not taxable. So if you raise $10 million in equity investment, you have $10 million net in your bank account. Selling tokens is considered a business. So if you raise money from selling tokens, it's taxable. So there's also a tax benefit in raising money through equity rather than tokens.
I mean, one thing that I think we're assuming this equity model, but companies or projects can still go full decentralization pretty early on. So, and this is a question to the group, how do you see this divide? Which projects should go, set up the foundation, think about decentralization? Which ones should go a bit more traditional way? Do you have any insights on that? Chris.
I'll try and speak louder this time. Yeah, I mean, I guess, to Yoni's point, SAFTs were all the rage, token-only deals.
So SAFT, it's simple agreement for a future token.
Yeah.
We're not very complex, acronyms.
Yeah, so those were all the rage. And then we did see a shift to, more traditional models, equity plus tokens, things like that. But in terms of how to assess what to do, I mean, I would always think about who are the likely investors, what are their preferences likely to be. So if you're planning to raise from angels, token only might be fine. If it's US VCs, they're often going to want equity plus tokens. But it's something that can be negotiated. If it's a really good project, VCs that typically want equity plus tokens will just take tokens if you say that's all you're going to get. So I guess it depends. But yeah, I would be thinking a lot about who are the likely investors, how do you want this business to grow, and then go from there. I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah. And we touched upon it earlier, is also decentralization. Like, will you decentralize at some point? Do you already know that? If you know from the outset you're going to decentralize, like, how? Will you have a wrapper in which someone can invest, or will it be like a floating DAO that's there and controls the funds? So that's also important because it leads to the question of where value will be created. So having a mix of equity and tokens is actually relevant if you don't know yet where the value will be created. It allows you to have potentially best of both worlds if you have values on both. But on the other hand, if you get equity, but then everything gets decentralized from an investor perspective, that's not extremely relevant. So it's good to do the due diligence from the investor side, but then also to know what you're offering to the investor on your side. And this leads to a lot of questions.
Yeah. And you talked about the investor outlook, and I do want to ask another question, which is, what type of rights do you see that investor will probably ask founders here with the audience that are maybe special to Web3? One thing that I've seen, and you may completely disagree, is that with all these Cayman foundations or Swiss foundation and other entities, there was no governance. Now we go back to governance, more board, a board structure and rights at that level. So what do you see in terms of specific rights investors are and should be looking for, and that the companies should understand it is the rules of the game?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Didn't first start or I have one information. It's
Yeah.
information rights. This
Yeah.
is especially after everything that happened end of last year, just to understand what's happening in the entity, no matter the governance, just to be informed, because we've realized that a lot of investors just gave the money, then just do your thing, and the project was evolving and you had no visibility whatsoever on what happened in the meantime. So there was something that you read in the white paper initially, you got some initial numbers, and then everything shifted over 6 months, and as an investor you had no clue what's going on. So now it's more like having some vision on the financials, on what is going on, how you issue things, how you consider things. It's really information rights, which actually shareholders do have most of the time anyways. And here it's even in token deals, you get those information rights that they request.
Yoni?
I think we saw in general, also non-web, like Web2 companies, let's call them, in the past couple of years where there's been crazy euphoria. Investors were also investing in various convertible instruments and things like that, safes, where they also weren't getting any rights. And you had a crazy situation where companies raised tens of millions of dollars and had no oversight. So I don't think it's unique to crypto. It seems to happen in any kind of industry where there gets overhyped. And given the market conditions now, we're seeing things reverting back to kind of the way they used to be, where investors want certain rights. And I think one point in particular is that oftentimes in safes or in SAFs with tokens, other than the governance, they also weren't doing anything to make sure the founders were committed to the venture. Like in traditional equity rounds, usually founders have some kind of restrictions on selling their shares. They have some kind of vesting that if they leave the company, they can't. They have to get back part of the shares. They can't. In tokens, you also have lockups where you make sure that the founders can't sell their tokens more than a certain amount of tokens over a certain period of time. And that's something that's I think investors are definitely asking for now. Just to look at retention, look how the company's structured, and make sure that people are committed long term to the vision.
Chris?
Yoni stole my point. Definitely seeing more push for founders to be sort of locked in or restricted, or things like that in SAFs and safes and other things. The other thing we've seen, if you go back in time, sort of 12 months, people were doing these pretty enormous deals with no due diligence. Where do I sign? Here's the money. And now, lots of, advising lots of sort of clients that are raising money. The lead VCs are doing, proper due diligence. So they're really, really looking into the underlying structure, the regulatory position, the founders, where they are, or, doing sort of a proper job that maybe when things were all going up, they were just, didn't have time and everything was sort of overheated and deals were crowded.
Yeah, that's very important. We're coming up on the last question before we open the floor to the audience, and in which I want to ask each of the panelists to give kind of your hard taught lessons, things that you've seen, mistake that you've seen, projects that were kind of under your purview, or even not, things that you really want to convey founders or any person who's involved in Web3. You can start with Chris, so Yoni doesn't steal his points. So go ahead.
It's a point that I made before, but I think the focus should be right at the start. The business first focus. So what are you doing? Is it centralized exchange? Is it a DeFi protocol? Is it a game? How is that going to work? How should the team be involved going forward? So a lot of teams don't really consider that, okay, we're going to go decentralized, we're going to do a foundation, we're going to do a token, but we still sort of want to run it and be involved and call all the shots, and without realizing that that's not really how it works if you're going to have a proper offshore structure. So that, I guess, that would be my big takeaway. And then the other thing is, I guess, you don't know what you don't know, and so at sort of crucial points, you should really be getting some advice, from local council, offshore council, before you go off, to Anna's point, before you go off and set up an entity in the wrong jurisdiction and find out it's actually not a good thing.
Yeah. Anna?
I would start with be honest and more or less transparent with what the goals are. There are no bad goals. Is it centralized or decentralized? Like, both have their advantages. And there was this trend of let's go decentralized, or let's be centralized to reassure people who don't feel comfortable with decentralized. Just do some introspection, identify what you want to do over time, and just communicate about that. Don't say you're a DAO if you're have someone who has control over centralized wallets and things like that. So just state it from the outset and then go ahead from there. Same, ask yourself from the outset, what exactly am I doing? Will it be regulated or not? And depending on that, you can also take this into account in your business plan. Oh, I may need some budget to hire a good lawyer because I'm doing derivatives on blockchain. So this is something to be taken into account, and you can't figure it out 6 months later. You should know from the outset that you need this money. And the last thing is, like, just call a lawyer maybe. I know this is like an expense, but if you do some financial related things on blockchain, maybe not if you have like a cultural DAO, or if you do like sports online that has no gambling aspect, but as soon as you touch upon finance, this is not like an extra expense. It will save you a lot of money afterwards. It's easier to structure from the outset than do some disaster recovery, because this costs way more. So like one of the things is think what you're doing. If there's a risk, maybe spend the money first and at least feel safe afterwards.
Yeah. Yoni?
I was thinking of three things, I think slightly overlapping with Anna and Chris. One is that definitely plan ahead. We see it's a very complex, Web3, even though it's becoming more mainstream, it's still a very complex structure. You have many more regulations than you have in a typical startup, both in terms of structuring and in terms of how you can do things. And particularly in Israel, which is a very restrictive country, from a legal perspective, if you start something, it's very hard to undo it afterwards. And there's usually costs, not just legal, but there could be tax implications and things like that. So it's very important to take the time and it's not like a regular startup where you come, you get a founder's agreement, you get an NDA, and you're good to go. Here, it's really important to think ahead and structure things properly. The second thing I would say is don't assume that just because somebody else is doing something that's really something that you can do. I think the recent events of the past 6 months, companies like FTX and Voyager and BlockFi, just because somebody else is doing something, even if they're successful, it doesn't mean that it's legal. Oftentimes, founders will come and they'll say, we can't do that. And then they say, well, this guy and this guy and this guy are doing that. And it's not necessarily an answer, because oftentimes other people might not have done the proper diligence. And I think you have to think for yourself and not just try to copy what other people did. And the third thing I would say is that because the crypto space has like these very violent waves where things go up like crazy and down like crazy, people have a tendency to hop onto fads, right? Like last year was NFT, so all of a sudden tons of NFT companies popped up, and people are trying to there are some people that succeed and get the company in time and just get out in time and make money, but that's almost like gambling. And I think if you're starting a company, it should be less based on fads and more, what do I see the long-term vision? How do I see this company existing 5 years from now, and build something that you really believe in rather than something that you hope can just be a quick money maker.
Yeah, very good point. Chris, you want to add?
Yeah. Another point is, there's a tendency at the start, at startup phase to maybe cut some corners, don't get legal advice, maybe take sort of a slightly risky regulatory position on, some activity. But I think you should always be thinking, if this business goes really well and we do really well, these things will become really big problems. If you want to start getting institutional investors or clients or things like that, the fact that you've cut corners and you're on shaky regulatory ground is not going to be a good thing. And so, I just would reiterate that.
Even because of like international pressure and regulatory pressure, even offshore jurisdictions now have regulations. So you can't assume that you can go to Cayman or something and just do whatever you want. There's a strong current pressure from international organizations, and unless you go to some like really crazy place, you're going to have regulations, even if it is kind of like a more friendly jurisdiction. You're still going to have to comply with some things.
You can go to Cayman for the weather.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Then it's also your users, because you don't want to like cut all jurisdictions out. So you may have users in the US, for example, like in Europe, where you have regulation as well. So it may become complicated if you want to have a minimum viable product. Viable also entails like something that will not get crushed by regulators just because you forgot about that aspect.
Definitely. A lot of things to think about. So with that, I want to open the floor to the room. Yes. We have, what's your name? Amanda. Okay. Go ahead.
So now that we have like a strong narrative on progressive decentralization, which kind of involves giving investors some equity and then maybe eventually having a governance token, in terms of decision making of what the board of directors from an equity perspective does and decide versus what the token holders decide, how do you guys see that evolution of who takes priority over the other, holder?
Okay.
So equity versus token holders.
Yeah. I'll let the panel start with answering. Yoni, you want to maybe? So the question was, when you have a crypto project and you have a board of directors with basically veto rights and various rights to make choices, how do you take the power away and give it to the token holders? At which point, in which manner, how is this tension is being resolved?
First of all, I want to say it's really strange talking into a microphone because you think your voice is getting louder, but it's not. Yeah, so I think that's a good question, because I think, when you have a company and founders and investors, typically you don't have external people on boards of startup companies, right? You have the founders, you have the investors, maybe you bring in some industry expert after a few years, and it's really closely held. And if a project like that wants to evolve to become a decentralized project, first of all, to make it really decentralized, you need to have external people on the board that are part of the project, not necessarily early investors or founders. And also, in terms of the community, there's a strong current in the community that they won't trust projects where they're too centralized, right? Like if the founders hold too many tokens and the investors hold too many tokens, or if they control everything, people are really looking to see how is this project going to be decentralized. And I've seen clients, when they start putting up posts saying their foundation structure, all of a sudden the backlash from the comments is like, this isn't really decentralized, you guys are tools of the financial industries, and we don't like your venture. So it's really important, I think, and you see that as people set up foundations and as the project grows, it's also easier to, when you first start a project, it's harder to get industry people involved and really committed to spending time and efforts in that. And as projects grow and evolve, then it's easier to bring them. So I think you see often that by the time it's like more mature and ready to go be released to the public, they have brought on people from the community. They have that, and kind of like the structure changes from being a founder investor controlled entity to a more community driven project.
Other questions?
We can add on that one.
Yeah, if there's no other question, we'll talk 20 minutes about this question. No.
It was a good question.
Yeah. So if there's anything you want to add, and Chris also we'll later turn it over to you.
Yeah, because it was actually a great question, because like progressive decentralization is maybe the only reasonable way to do it, because having from the outset something that's decentralized with like 100 people or 20 people cooperating together.
So progressive decentralization, just to make sure I understand, it's decentralizing each step at a time. Not immediately issuing a token and the smart contract is free in the ether. It's doing it in steps.
Yeah. Because like imagine everyone voting on who to hire and how to go forward. This will not work out. From a management perspective, this is not yet there. Mm-hmm. But one of the things is also to know what do you decentralize. For example, we have a lot of split between the technology and the operations. So you keep the technology ownership of the IP on the smart contracts being decentralized, and there's some value being generated there. So investors will gather some of the value out of this aspect, while operations and all the fees collected on services go to the decentralized part. Mm-hmm. So that is also something to know. Potentially you should know it from the outset, but it's complicated sometimes to identify that. Mm-hmm. And to know the split and just to decide, okay, what do I decentralize, and have some clarity on that. Mm-hmm. And like how both interact as well, because in Switzerland we have some structures where the wrapper actually includes both aspects. So you have an association where you have a board, you have the members, they are often like the investors, and then on the other side you have within the association the DAO, that's like a community of token holders. So there it's a bit easier, I would say, to have both types of people happy about how it works, but then there's still more power, for example, for the association on top of token holders. So it's also like, do you want them to have actual power or not? And when you have investors, just to from the outset tell them, okay, we are going and aiming at full decentralization over time. You'll be just one of the members with tokens later in time.
Yeah. Chris? Famous last word.
Yeah, I don't have much. I had a really good question. We see this issue come up a lot in practice with DAOs and foundations we advise, and that tension between what should token holders community have a vote on, say on, and to end point, you sort of don't want to do token holder votes for everything operational, like which lawyers to engage and sort of minor things like that. And often I think you sort of can't do that at the start anyway, unless you already have sort of an engaged, dispersed community. So even if you want to be decentralized or go sort of token holder control on day one, you're just not going to have a very wide mix of token holders that you actually want to put, sort of control in. And so I think we sort of see, a tendency to go more board control at the start, and with a view to bringing in token holders, at the right time. Quite what that time is I guess, up for debate.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and thanks everyone for joining us. And have a great day here at Building Blocks.